are we ready to share?
All right, yep. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Sarah Lang. I work at the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation. I manage the Southern Vermont Economy Project, which is funded by USDA Rural Development. And the project provides workshops, trainings, technical assistance for our grant partners and the wider Southern Vermont region. We sort of happened upon this actually from one of our grant partners, Sue Westa at Wyndham Regional. She had let us know about Incremental Development Alliance and connected us. And we looked into it more and really loved the technical assistance that they provide to communities and thought that Rockingham was a great candidate for that. So Jim Kumin is here and Gary Fox is here. And I'm going to hand it over to them to give more detail. But essentially, this is one of many different sessions that's happening over, I guess we started in December and probably through March. Some sessions are public sessions like this, other are sort of internal, working within the town of Rockingham, and we'll sort of jump more into the details. I'm going to hand it over to Gary Fox and we'll get started.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gary, Development Director at Town of Rockingham. And it's about a year ago, we came out of the Vermont Council on Rural Development community visit with three challenges, three opportunities. One of the top three, one of those was building redevelopment in Bellows Falls. A lot of good participation, had over 30 stakeholders engaged on the committee. The meeting a couple of weeks before COVID hit, and then it stalled out with the advent of our stay-at-home orders. And a number of months later, BDCC's Southern Vermont Economy Project approached us with this opportunity for Incremental Development Alliance to get some technical assistance for all of these our citizen stakeholders, really understanding the whole ecosystem around development, and the fact that it focuses in small scale, rural, human scale was really intriguing. And after some calls with the stakeholders, interest calls with Jim Kumin, who's really inspiring around the opportunity and the assistance, we took that up, and it was made possible. A lot of folks supported this. We had, the Southern Vermont Economy Project pitched in, Vermont Council on Rural Development, Vermont Natural Resources Council, the Preservation Trust of Vermont, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, and the Vermont Community Foundation all pitched in broad basis support to make it happen. And so thank you. And I'll turn that over to Jim to lead us off.
Hi there, everybody. Hope everything good with the screen now. Sarah, has it come back on? Yes, great. Okay. I'm Jim Kumin. I'm the Executive Director of the Incremental Development Alliance. And we are based in Minnesota, but working throughout the country to provide technical assistance and training for folks who want to be involved in real estate and community development issues in their place. And so today's lecture is to provide an overview of different themes and forces working within that realm and within the types of things. And we're going to make some specific nods to some things going on inside of Vermont as well as here in Rockingham to talk about how can we see the kind of development that we'd like to have in our communities, and who's involved in that work, and how do we support them in making that from idea to reality. And so many of you, as I understand from going through the RSVP list with the team here, have had some direct involvement with your business sector or with the town government, or serve on a commission. And so knowing that tonight, given who we've got in the room, hoping to make a few asides to the thought process of your roles and where you can play a part in doing this, or even become a part of the process. And perhaps maybe you own a building or a property and would like to see it evolve and change into something more or something better for your business or for your family. And so we'll talk a little about the opportunities towards the end of the evening perhaps that you can take a lead role in that for yourself. The idea, though, that I'll start out with, and we'll talk a little more about our organization as we go, is that we're cultivating neighborhoods, and neighborhoods are the basic building block of the places in our country, whether they're big cities or small towns. And so the connection point we want to make tonight, though, is that neighborhoods, while they're physical places and they're filled with humans, that there's also a financial aspect. And that's the kind of key part about real estate, is that there is math involved with how our humans and our buildings interact with each other, and how that interaction also provides us with the opportunity to do things together, right? Through government in many cases, where our government supplies resources and services and quality of life to its citizens. And there is a relationship between real estate and our governance, and how we fund that, and how we are able to provide the resources to improve those things that we can do collectively. And so tonight I want to kind of work through a series of topics that will help connect the dots between individual projects, people who are small developers, folks in town government, and the types of communities and neighborhoods we want to see both today and into the future. And hopefully put a few thought-provoking items in there as well to talk about things that maybe don't come up as often in these topic realms as we would otherwise maybe see in other places. So with that, we'll hopefully go maybe 45 or 50 minutes here, dig in. And as Sarah has said in the chat window, feel free to ask me questions in writing while I'm going. I might be able to kind of tell you it's coming up or fit it in along the way. But if not, we absolutely will have time at the end for more live Q&A and to kind of to double back on any topics you want to revisit. So we'll pick up what we can along the way, and if not, we'll catch those questions and comments at the end. So with that, we'll launch right in. So the Incremental Development Alliance, we are celebrating our 5th anniversary. We started in 2015, and our main mission is to cultivate, we'd like to see 1,000 new small developers in cities and towns across the country who want to support that work of small and incremental development. And as an organization, we're focused on the how-to. There's plenty of organizations who are advocates and policymakers and government agencies at various different levels of government providing resources. And what we realize and what we are as an alliance is a group of people who have pulled together the shared wisdom of many people trying to do this work in their communities and sharing the hard-fought lessons and tools of implementation. And so while you may have heard talks and other information about many things we're going to talk about tonight, part of what we do is to pull many of those threads, which are often discussed and talked about on their own: housing, job development, local services like our parks and our streets. All those pieces of the puzzle sometimes get discussed on their own rights, but they're not always fit together in a way that makes sense or that helps us reach our goals. And so as an alliance of doers, we're also trying to make sure that we are focused on the things that we can accomplish and to be able to create common ways to get to yes as we get there. As we will talk about during tonight's talk, there are some impediments that many communities face in seeing that future world come to their place or even be legal in their place. So we're going to talk about some of those common things as a way to discuss what we will be doing both with the upcoming events and discussions that we'll be having as a part of this project with the town of Rockingham, but also other opportunities within Vermont and further afield for people to become involved as implementers onto their own right. So I'm going to start with a little nod. As we enter, I heard today that we are on the 1-year anniversary, I think it was today, of the first known coronavirus I guess diagnosis in the country. And you know, we all know where that has led us in the last 10 to 12 months. And so we reached that time where many places were in lockdown, and you know, all of a sudden there was a newfound craze to dust off some age-old practices in human civilization, like baking bread. And all of a sudden, because all of us seem to have a lot of time on our hands and we're more or less locked in our homes, we found that we all were doing the same things at the same time, like wanting to bake bread from scratch. And so there was a very interesting situation that occurred at that point in, I guess it was March, April, where all of a sudden everyone bought every packet of yeast they could find, practically in the whole wide country. And so there was a very interesting sort of challenge that came up at that point in time well, let's just make more yeast. There's this huge demand. How do we do this? And so I got to read some really interesting articles about what unfolded in the process of trying to deliver more raw ingredients for the insatiable but short-lived need for everyone to bake their own bread. And it's an interesting story about how this plays out, but two sides of the equation. First of all, we need yeast, right? And why are we talking about yeast? Well, yeast is the active ingredient, right? Without it, bread isn't just quite the same. It's more kind of a, maybe a soda bread, or it's dense and is sometimes hard to chew, right? And yeast is that active agent that gives bread its most bread-like qualities. There's lots of ways to bake bread, but most breads get baked with some sort of yeast. And so yeast is an ingredient that is actually a chemical reaction, and it is a natural process, right? And there's only so many things that we have figured out as humans to speed up that very natural process. We're literally growing through a chemical process, from 1 cell to 2 cells and further up, right? We're doubling. And it is a production process that can't only go so quickly, right? On the other side of the equation, once you had say somebody had magically known to stockpile, vats and vats of yeast, and we had it ready to go. Like, gosh, let's sell some yeast. The Americans, want this, right? We have this other problem about a supply chain, right? We had this issue where, in many cases, the commercial bakeries, which would buy yeast in huge barrels, right, all of a sudden didn't need those huge barrels anymore. And on the flip side, what most families at home needed was not a vat of yeast, but a little 7 to 11 gram packet, right? So now we also have a different problem in the supply chain, where even if we had plenty of yeast, which we didn't, but at some point when we caught up, we also had insufficient packing capacity, right? We have lots of big containers of yeast for commercial, bakeries, but what we need is little foil packages of yeast to spread through households around the country. And so these two different issues created a situation where we had sometimes some of what we needed, but not enough. Sometimes we had the right ingredients, but we had them packaged incorrectly, right? And so in either case, we lack the ability to get to the thing we needed, and because we had them in the wrong scale, the wrong proportion, or the wrong quantity. And so in many cases, small development and development in general has some similar problems, right? How come, when we used to be able to do these questions, these lectures live, and I'd be seeing you all in person, live in person, I used to ask a question: are you getting the kind of real estate development you'd like to see in your town? And in a room of 50 or 100 people, I'd say, hey, raise your hand if you're seeing the kind of development that you're looking for in your town. And then I had this joke about, hey, this is the public participation part where you raise your hands, actually show, right? And then there's always like 1 or 2 people in the back of the room who sheepishly put their hand up and say, well, it's okay, I guess, right? And everyone else is like, giggling because they're like, this is the state of real estate. And no matter where I went, small rural towns, big urban cities, that same situation would happen over and over again. And so the question is, what is the active ingredient missing in so many places in our country today that we cannot get the kind of development we're looking for? What's the active ingredient, right? And turns out there's more than one, just one thing. We have this little diagram we show here that we often use to teach our small developers a little bit about the sort of core values and thought processes, right? The one thing I can't teach another human is hustle, right? That's something you learn by example. It's something you maybe even have innately in you. But I can teach you know-how, and I can work with people to build relationships. And so this is what we need in our places. And we sometimes call our communities in a little technical way, ecosystems, because that's what they are. There is a variety of different types of knowledge, relationships, and hustle that every place needs to have. And every place has a different variety and a different scale and proportion of these items. But if you are missing one of these items, right, or it is in too low a supply or in the wrong packaging, then you have a stopping point in your process. And so what we want to first and foremost talk about in our places is that we need people with skills. Those skills have to be able to formulate a project that works in the local ecosystem of finance and building codes and the humans that are there and what they want. And that ecosystem, in the way our society works and our economic system works, there has to be an allowance for something to happen, the regulatory environment in most cases for something to happen, and there has to be a risk-reward ratio where the reward taken for the risk is commensurate. Right? And so neighborhoods that can keep that ecosystem healthy, right, that risk-reward ratio, enough people with the right skills, that is a marketplace that will then take advantage of that opportunity. We need to be able to have the right mixture of those elements. And so what we are endeavoring here to do in Rockingham in the coming weeks and months is to look at part of the ecosystem, particularly the regulatory environment, but other items as well in a more cursory way, and talk about what do we have here? What is our strengths? Who are our people? What are our rules? And are they set up in a way to interact with each other, right, that we get the outcome, right? If we add yeast and flour and water, do we get the right kind of bread we're looking for? And the interesting part about the yeast crisis that happened, and slowly but surely was through the goodness of time resolved, was that many of the people who wrote about these yeast shortages also said, you know, the good news is that yeast does not require some exotic set of chemicals and ingredients in order to make it happen. It turns out that by taking some flour, some water, and some dry fruit or sugary thing, or some beer, you can make a fermentation that actually will yield what we otherwise know as yeast. But this was a fantastic quote that I found in one of the articles about that, right? Making your own yeast. The quote was, "The resulting product won't act as predictably and consistently as what you buy in a little packet at the store, but it may imbue your baked goods with a certain distinctive character." We talk so much in community development, real estate development, about the need for our places, our neighborhoods to have character. Some places, in a lot of our towns, we're full of characters, right? The humans involved, right? And so that character is really important to a place. And I can tell from the time I had a chance to spend in your region and in Rockingham that there is a lot of character in your place, an incredible history, and some really great people who want the place to continue to become better and better. And those are the active ingredients that are most important. But it's also sometimes overlooked that in real estate development, especially, that we're waiting for somebody else to come and save us, right? We're looking for that nicely packaged, perfectly allotted yeast. If we only had someone who could provide that perfect thing that we need to have, right, everything would be better, right? And sometimes we use that mythology for a lot of different things, not just real estate development in our world and our society. But what I'm here to tell you is that there likely are no one coming to save you. You are the people you are waiting for. And it may turn out that the DIY yeast you use that may imbue character in your place may not be the perfect outcome that you've seen in another town, or maybe happened in your place in the past. But however, is the kind of process and outcome that will make your place continue to be your place and will achieve the objectives that you're all collectively looking for. And so what I leave you with this very long analogy is that it may be the fact that the best possible outcome may not be the one that you've been looking for. And we can talk more about where we can find that process and look forward to what the DIY yeast could do for you in your place with the right kind of surrounding ingredients. So as an organization at Incremental Development Alliance, we train, we coach, and we connect. These are the things that we do in order to help look at our ecosystem and to help provide that knowledge, mentorship, and side-by-side learning opportunities that we hope will continue to be able to provide here over the coming weeks and months. But this is how we do it, and this is how we hope that you will be a part of our learning as we share with the next communities who will come after you, who want to do this work as well. And we hope that what we learn here in Vermont will not only be helpful for other communities in Vermont and New England, but in other places across the country. And so the great part about this work and the way we look at it especially is that at the neighborhood scale, it is the basic building block of our place. Right? Bellows Falls in particular may be really nothing more than one big neighborhood, right? And that is the whole town. But a neighborhood is built with blocks and lots, right? That's the basic building structure. No matter if you're a small town or a big city, right? Big cities are really just, assemblages of neighborhoods, right? Some whole wings of a city sometimes have their own, nature, right? Heck, New York City has 5 boroughs, right? And each of those cities could be, each of those boroughs could be, one of the biggest cities in the country by themselves, right? But they're still just neighborhoods, right? And they have the same scale and size of buildings in many places as you all have in the town of Rockingham and nearby. And so that's why we focus on the neighborhood scale, because at the 1 to 3 story scale of building, which we focus on mostly, usually anywhere between 500 to 5,000 square feet, sometimes a little bit bigger. We have small scale buildings, and we have bigger buildings that are thought of and could be evolved incrementally, right? So we have an incredible built environment left from different eras of time where space was used differently. And now we have a different economy in some cases. And so sometimes those larger buildings have to be reinvigorated through a thought process and an economic proving out in a new model in a more incremental fashion, right? Instead of trying to take down the big building, the big project, we can take a risk in smaller pieces, maybe use part of a building over a longer period of time to be able to slowly work our way up in a way that's less risky. And in a way that proves the pathway forward. And that's the part about what we build that we feel is important, is that a neighborhood is never complete, all right? Over the last 50 to 75 years in this country, at the scale that we built new subdivisions or big box stores and industrial parks and other things, there's an idea that you built something and it was complete, right? It was the way you planned it, it came that way, you built it, and then it was done. Well, in most of human civilization, we didn't build neighborhoods that were complete, right? And in most places, when we built places like that, they were never as good as they were on their wedding day, right? That first day that was the best they ever got, right? And they only slowly got worse from there. Some of the best neighborhoods in our country have evolved and reinvigorated themselves over and over and over and over again. And Bellows Falls is a place like that. To be able to have that evolution of different types and uses in buildings over time. And so question that came up here, and I'll talk about it right now because it's a perfect slide to talk about how to incubate and fill a building. And what is the scale and types of buildings, right? There are great new building typologies that are in fact not new, right? Small cottages, building up in temporary spaces, moving different. So we consider the part of the incremental process to start in a tent, right? Because many places we go to, we'll go, especially New England, some of their small towns that have very empty main streets, and their storefronts are empty. They say, where do we find people to be able to work in these storefronts? How will these buildings survive? And the answer is you have to cultivate those entrepreneurs and those people who can do that, or figure out that you truly just have too much of that kind of space, and what is a good way for those spaces, particularly at the edges, can be used for something different, whether it's housing or makerspace or something else that's different. But the good news about most older buildings is that they were set up well to be evolved and changed. And so we take every step of the way seriously in that process, whether it is a tent that leads to somebody being able to establish their business, to then that they get a truck, or they go into an existing storefront on a low lease because it's been vacant for a long time. And it allows people to work their way up their businesses and their buildings over time. And so the processes and the know-how, there's another question here about renovation versus perhaps new construction. And these are skill sets that are living culture. They're living languages. The know-how of old buildings is a live knowledge base. And frankly, we've lost a lot of that knowledge base. We often joke, and I saw some beautiful buildings on our virtual tour of the town there. You know, we look at these rectangular buildings with vertically oriented windows, beautiful daylight, you know, gorgeous human scale detailed masonry and wood details, right? And we say, who built these buildings, right? How come we can never get these buildings again today? What lost race of humans came to this town 250 years ago and built these rectangular buildings with vertically oriented windows, right? With human scale details. It wasn't actually rocket science, but the number of masons left in the state of Vermont who could build most of the Main Street buildings in your place, right, is like, you could probably put them all in one town, right? Like it is a way, we have built things differently and have a process of construction for a long time that's different. So part of this know-how and this implementation work is to be able to relearn that know-how, to share that information, and sometimes to have to, in some cases, re-experiment in your own place again to build up that knowledge base. That's a hard way to do things. There are ways that we hopefully can bring some of that knowledge to your community, but in many cases, it's still going to have to be retained by locals, right? In the old days of our towns, many people had to have lots of hats, and that's still probably true in the case in your place. And so we're trying to encourage and actually celebrate the fact that wearing many hats, having more than one type of skill set is important to your economy and is important to the vitality of the things that you can have in your place. We're trying to accomplish an idea of how to build wealth, particularly intergenerational wealth. I'm not going to dwell too much on these two pieces, but most of that wealth is really full in two different buckets, you know, for our families and for our communities. We're going to talk a little bit about both of these as we go, so I don't want to spend too much time here at the moment. But building wealth through real estate is one of the ways that our ancestors did build that wealth. This is a quick story about the donut shop. And this is a development by one of our faculty members. And the short story is that the person who came and bought this building did so because they were able to live, and this is a building that's actually quite recent, it's not old, but it looks old, and it follows patterns that are old and follows economic practices that are old. And yet, you know, sometimes we've lost track of that. They were able to live in the rear part of this building, which is an apartment, and work to reestablish their business, which is a donut shop, in this new location. And then once it was reestablished, they were able to go buy their house and rent that building out, which also helped, you know, in times of stress like a pandemic, be able to help support the structure, the financial structure of that building, right? Because it wasn't just how many donuts you sold, could you pay the rent? It was somebody else providing you rent from a different source of income in a way that would help you stay through hard times. And the best news about this is if this donut shop was not an owner occupant, did they not own the building, they might disappear in the next economic downturn, as we've now experienced, right? But the donut shop, who has a really good relationship with their landlord because it's themselves, right? They can weather hard times, right? And they can build wealth over the long time. If you're going to run that very same donut shop through a franchise and have to buy into a franchise, you might need $500,000 of wealth, and you're going to pay that back in a loan over time. Now, is that a terrible model? Not necessarily. It's just a different model. And there's different structures in economic terms for these different models. So it's important to understand those things. It's important to understand that if your place is more apt to be able to support the local independent donut shop, that your ecosystem, your rules, and the way that you support each other in the local economy work to strengthen those things. Okay? And that one of the gifts from our ancestors is that by very necessity, most of the buildings that they built 100, 200 years ago were doing so out of sheer frugality and desperation, right? That's what they had. And they built it in a way that allowed them to continue to take what they had and build it up over time. We can learn a lot from our ancestors about that kind of process that allows us to not over leverage ourselves, which causes us challenges in the long run when we have headwinds in our economy and our local communities. One other little thing I'll throw in here, because it is a topic of the year in terms of the wealth gap that we have. And this is talking particularly about between different ethnicities, but every community has a wealth gap of some sort. Sometimes it is very much tied to ethnicity. Other times it's simply tied to class. The point is that we have folks across all spectrums of our communities who are in the higher versus lower categories of median net worth and financial capacity. What's important to understand is that those who are in the higher level enjoy capacity to continue to be in that higher level. And those in the lower level, in many cases, lack any chance for being able to bridge and move up that ladder. And so while these numbers are particularly about race and ethnicities and the gaps that we have as a country on these fronts, you will also find that those gaps also exist across different classes in your community. It's important to understand where those different thresholds are at. And what's really interesting about this is the information in particular that was updated over 3 to 4 years. And these numbers, looking at this trajectory, right? We peaked in 07, right before the Great Recession, and then fell off a cliff, and then slowly have been working our way back, right, in being able to do this. Now, over the course of 10 years, we've managed to only recreate and get back to another $17,000 in net worth, right? And we've still not yet got back to that wealth that we held in 2007. And so the question is, how long was it going to take to get us back to this peak? And will we ever actually get back to this peak? And it's important to talk about that because these numbers were updated just before the pandemic started, just before we had all these other issues that unfolded environmentally and otherwise. And so when we have to face stressors, we have to understand where these underlying systems of wealth gaps are coming from and what can we do to help make an ecosystem for our families in our communities of various household types and sizes be able to overcome those things. And some of these things have been expressed in our time here working in Rockingham about not enough homeowners, right? And but then simultaneously we have lots of well-paying jobs, and people at those well-paying jobs say they can't find the right kind of housing in the community they want to live in, right? So what happens there? We have a lot of aging population in Vermont, and but just because you are older does not mean you have the retirement savings necessary to have a true retirement, right? And for those who are younger, we have an incredibly high student debt rate and ratios that really cripple people from entering the housing market particularly. And so we ask this question, how healthy is your city for building wealth, right? To be able to take on these different aspects of the work, and how do we do that? We'll speed through this section here. Those of you who are involved in government will understand that every neighborhood has its own story. We also have different development patterns that shape our neighborhoods. This picture is of a human scale development pattern. This scale is an auto scale development pattern. And it turns out the math that those places create as a function of the way that the infrastructure, like this road that we're sitting on here, the cost of that infrastructure and the maintenance of that infrastructure over time, and the value of the land use that is adjacent to it, right? Between the two pictures is a very different proportion. There are folks, I know that Joe Minicozy from Urban 3 has done some work in Vermont, and I think there's some more things we could talk about on this work, but the long and short of it is that some places have land use, and this map here, the drawing you're seeing, is that this is an entire county in Lafayette, Louisiana, and this is every single parcel in the entire county, in the parish, as they call them down south there. And every one of those little bars is an individual parcel, and the parcels that create more revenue than they take to maintain their share of infrastructure, right? Those are in green. Those that take more infrastructure than they create in value on a per acre basis, value per acre, are in red. Can you guess where downtown Lafayette is, right? Where is that historic core, right? Oh, it's right there in the middle. And there's some very modest neighborhoods that many folks see as the poor and down and out parts of town, which in fact are not green, and they're certainly not red. They're kind of in between. They're these low kind of green areas here, right? And that surprises some people. Many folks think that the shiny and new is very much the kind of development patterns that are actually providing the wealth in the community. And in fact, the ratio of land versus infrastructure is a very important thing. And that productivity is something that we should have an eye on at all times when we are making decisions about our land use and our rules and how our ecosystem works. This is another version of the same kind of conversation. And when we look at this kind of work, we say, well, this kind of value per acre, in this case, it's the purple lines here. This is in another county outside of Kansas City, Missouri. This is downtown Kansas City, right? This is not. This little spike here is a place called Westport. Well, what is Westport, right? Well, Westport turns out, as you can see, is a significant spike, right? It is a considerably higher place than some smaller towns nearby. You can see little spikes out here. They're little downtowns. What's going on in Westport? Well, this is a map actually of Westport. And turns out Westport was a small little town that was eventually annexed by the city of Kansas City over time. And I'm going to show you some examples of different building types. And you can see in a little blue dot over here on the right-hand side where those buildings are in town, right? Here's a duplex, a modest little duplex here. Here is a 6-unit walk-up building a few blocks away. Here is a larger multiplex. And there was a bunch of number we did in this place, looking at different sizes and intensities of buildings. You can see the value per acre goes up. There's different types of taxing structures in different parts of the country, but pay attention to this lower number for the time being. $186,000 per acre, 208, 320,000 per acre. Now, these are nice old buildings, right? But there's nothing fancy about them. They haven't all been fixed up. They're not luxury housing. They're just regular buildings that have been dutifully doing their jobs in this city for more than 100 years. And that kind of consistency in holding a value, flexibility, adaptability, evolution, right? That is the power of many of these small buildings and many of these small sites. And the aggregation of many of them together, as you can see, these are not buildings that anyone is getting rich on, right? This is not something fandangled and new, not something that is high bar, but the collection of these modest buildings and the small main street, which is literally only 2 blocks right here in the center of the picture on Broadway here, right? The main part of Broadway really is only 2.5 blocks. But yet look at the productivity of the way that the aggregation of those buildings come together and how strong and tall that they stand in comparison to the development patterns elsewhere in nearby this place. And so we ask you to take a look at the productivity of your land use and understand what is working best for you and work to reinforce those best habits. So why are you not getting development you're looking for in your place? And I'm going to skip right to the chase here. There are 3 pretty cross-country reasons why in most places that we're not seeing the kind of development we're looking for. One is that we have a cultural habit of extractive land development, throwaway buildings, okay? And we used to only be able to have so much. And so we had to make the most of that built environment. Over the last 60-something years, we got in love with the shiny and new. We had subsidies like the highway system and other things that are in our tax code that incentivized and quite frankly made the most viable financial option to be something different than a human scale neighborhood. And so that has created and given rise to economic models that have a tendency to extract more than they regenerate, okay? And secondly, in addition to that, we have a development industry and a regulatory industry that is related that is at crisis and sort of at odds with itself in many cases. So some of the things that we're going to talk about in future meetings, small group meetings that many of you have been invited to, and many of you will be invited into future conversations about this, may know that maybe your regulatory environment could use some updating. But we also have these sort of structural issues like your construction labor. Who is that in your town? Who builds things? Do you have to get people from the next town over, right? Because there's only so many humans in your place that can build things. And we have a number of sort of headwinds to this process of developing, whether it is old regulations, it is folks who fear change, and it's a human sort of natural human thought process. And so when change doesn't look like the thing that they think should be coming, or they don't understand what's possible from change, we resist. And it's a natural human thing. And understanding how we help our friends and neighbors know and understand the development patterns, and that we have an environment and an ecosystem that encourages what we want to see, not tries to just keep out the things we don't want to have the most, right? It's a different environment to be able to encourage what you want as opposed to try to repel what you don't want. If your ecosystem is in a repel mode, you will spend many more years wishing for something you're probably not going to get. We have to change that dynamic in a place in order to be able to make it productive to what you want to see happen. The last thing, if we didn't have all those problems already, is that we have a really interesting set of statistics that most of our housing stock in our country is actually detached single-family houses. And you say, okay, well, so what, Jim? That's interesting. The interesting part about that, and I've seen these numbers for Vermont, these numbers are as much, if not more, in many cases, in many parts of Vermont, that 83% of households in less than 9 years will have no children. That means 1 in 2 person households with no children. That will be 83% of the households in our country. And maybe you've seen some of these numbers locally, so I won't dwell too long on this. But what does that really mean? Well, it means if we have 62% of our housing stock, and the average house in this country is something between a 3 and 4 bedroom house with 2 to 3 car garages, right? If that is the ubiquitous housing stock we have the most of, and I will tell you that is true, but we have a population of 1 in 2 person households, right? We have a mismatch. We have a mismatch of buildings to people. And what we have and what we need don't fit well. And there's lots of great information about that has been done for Vermont and perhaps even your local area. And I'll defer to our local partners here to maybe share some of those resources if you haven't seen them. But what that creates is a market problem where some places that are desirable are so desirable because there's so few of them that they overheat, they become too expensive. In other places, we have a disinvestment challenge because the buildings or that place hasn't been able to evolve and take advantage of the things that our humans that we do have need, or humans that may come to our place may want as they come from the outside. And this is everywhere. This is little old Grayling, Michigan, way up here in the. I'm from Michigan originally, so right up here on the map. If you open up your Google, Grayling, Michigan, right up here in the middle of the lower peninsula, upper middle lower peninsula, and even in a place like Grayling, town of about 2,000 people every year. This is one of our faculty members who helps do market studies. She's actually going to be involved in providing a small market analysis for Rockingham. And she found that in this very small community, every year there is a need for this variety of housing, from fourplexes and townhomes to cottage houses to apartments above retail to slightly different mixed use lofts and flats. Okay, in a town of 2,000 people, right? That usually not thought of mixture, right? Non-single family detached houses, right? Or large single family detached houses in many cases. This is, cottage houses are still single family, but they're smaller, right? And so what I want to kind of go back to here is I want to actually, as all of you who are involved, particularly in government or playing a role in government, I want you to understand that the things we talked about earlier, right? When we were talking about the events of this year, many people say, gosh, we could never see a pandemic coming, or we could never see social unrest coming. We could never see these things happen. In fact, most of them that we've had this year have been activities that we actually could see coming, or that there was evidence of, or that we have a history in this country in our places of seeing these issues happen. And so I want to introduce you to this idea of anti-fragility, because it is a cornerstone of incrementality, right? You may have heard this idea of a black swan event. And black swan events are things that are both outliers, right? That they have two things. They have to have no historical precedent, right? And they have to have extreme impact. Right? 9/11 is often seen as a black swan event because it had no previous past. We've had terrorism that have happened in our country, but not that kind of terrorism in that kind of way with that kind of impact, right? And the many years of fallout, not just what happened in Manhattan, but what it did across our country economically and from a security perspective. However, pandemics have happened over millennia, right? This is not something that no one saw coming. Can you predict it? No. Can you prepare for it? Perhaps. Same thing with natural disasters. Same thing with things that we've seen environmentally that are happening in our places. Our climate is somehow doing different things than it used to do. What the cause of that is, we don't need to worry about, but it is different. And so being able to say, how is your place going to respond to these shocks, right? Regardless of what's causing them, can we see them coming or not? How can your place be set up to be what we call anti-fragile, a place that can take advantage and grow and become stronger from a stressor or a shock, right? Rather than being destroyed by it. This is different from being robust. Robust is being able to come back, right? Resiliency is being able to come back. Anti-fragility is actually not just coming back, but getting better as a result of coming back, okay? The other thing that comes along with this concept is that there is a preference when you are acting in an anti-fragile way to, if you're going to drop 100 feet, it is far preferable to drop that 100 feet in 1 foot increments, right? As opposed to 100 1-foot increments will lead you to a very different outcome in your fall as one single 100-foot drop all at once, okay? Anti-fragility says that if you have incremental and continuous feedback loops, right? Little drops, oops, ouch, that hurts. Not, I fell 100 feet and shattered every bone in my body, right? When you have local systems that reward redundancy, right? The ability that there's more than one shoemaker in town, more than one pizza place in town, right? That when that one pizza place closes, you don't have to drive 25 miles to the next pizza place, right? That redundancy, that skill set, those things make a place more anti-fragile. And so how we think about and plan for and work towards aligning our resources is important in making decisions moving forward, right? The next wave is coming, right? How will we prepare? How will we think about how to tackle that next wave? And so 2 things that we put forward here. We break down the big challenges and the big buildings and the big issues, right, with incremental steps, right, to limit the downside. We don't want that 100-foot drop. That's going to kill us. We might have to drop 100 feet. We're going to do so, and we're going to be ready to do so in a manner that will not result in a catastrophic ending. Same things, if you have aggregations of many small pieces, right, like that Westport I was talking about, right, that many small little seemingly inconsequential buildings, right? No one's going to show up in Bellows Falls and say, oh my God, this is the next thing past Paris. It is not a place that has like a significance that is like somehow like, oh my gosh, everybody would always know, right? But in fact is a beautiful, wonderful place, right? With a great local economy and great people. It is the aggregation of all the lots, all the history, all the people that make it special. I can tell it's special, and I've never stepped foot in the town because I've been able to talk with you, many of you on this call today. I've been able to see the built environment, and I've been able to look at many other places which don't have the things that your community has. You all can have a tremendous amount of possibility in your place by leveraging all the very small opportunities you have and doing so in a way that will help your place fare better than perhaps other places with the big shiny new things that they've over leveraged themselves to get and may fail catastrophically with the wrong stressor that we can't predict in the future. So it isn't always the big and sexy, but it is the way that most of our civilization has gotten along for many hundreds of years, right, through those small steps. Okay? So how do we get to places that can do this, right? One of the things that we're going to dive more into in future classes, future opportunities here, lectures, is the built environment. The built environment has some very specific thresholds in its financing and its our building code in particular. We also have a thing called zoning codes, right? And as it turns out, the people who make these things, authorize these things, put all these things together, they're different, right? Government agencies do some things, other government agencies do other things. Banks and investors yet have different rules and regulations and processes, right? And to make a real estate transaction happen, to make a building happen, all three of these things have to line up, plus other stuff. And so we want to help people understand where those common thresholds interact. Because as it turns out, a building, if it is a residential building, when it goes from being 2 units to being 3 units, it jumps over this line and it goes from one set of rules, the International Residential Code, to being another set of rules called the International Building Code. Right? There's some consequential changes in the requirements between those two. You should know and be on purpose to go between 2 units in a building and 3 units in a building because of that. Same thing. We have common financial tools in this country, namely the 30-year mortgage. The 30-year mortgage goes up to 4 units and actually can allow a certain amount of non-residential space in it under certain conditions. Once you exceed that threshold, you are now in a commercial loan, which has completely different underwriting requirements and requirements of the people who are going to do that project. Okay? And so part of what we teach people in our classes, and we'll have time to share more about here on future calls and webinars, is how those pieces fit together and how that works. And this is just a little example, all the different buildings that might be possible in your place and how they fit into those different categories. And so being able to understand, someone brought up a question earlier about vacant lots and what do you do to infill them? Well, is it a commercial vacant lot? You might take on some of these strategies down below here that are very modest, right? If they are residential structures, maybe you can build small cottages versus building a larger mixed-use building, right? These are all different choices you have to have in your place, and being able to understand the thresholds of external as well as internal ones you control, namely in your town, you control the zoning rules. You get to bake that cake. But you do have to know that you're doing so inside an ecosystem that has other rules that are set at the state and other federal levels, like for banking, to be able to interact with those and make sure that your rules line up with those other rules so that you make the easiest path to getting what you want in your community. Which goes to my final statement and final question here tonight as I start to close out here. People say, well, gosh, if I just had more people who knew how to do all this stuff, we would be able to make these things happen. And they say, Jim, how do you find small developers? Where do you find the mythical creatures, the small developer who can come into my town and do these things? And the answer is actually you don't find them. Right? You don't really lure them to your town. You grow them. They're actually amongst you. Some of you on this call, whether you know it or not, actually might be small developers, might have the skill sets and the relationships and the hustle to do this work. And the thing that you might not have, though, is a little bit of the technical knowledge about how to do such a thing in 2021 under the rules in your place and that we all share together. And so we have an educational class called a seminar where we teach people those very basic 101 formation process steps. We actually have one coming up here, sponsored by some of the very same groups and others in Vermont, coming up here on February 23rd. And we help people understand how simple, basic projects, things that you will see in your place, things that are affordable by many of you, perhaps on a 30-year mortgage, would work, right? We actually help people see how these places, how these types of projects could happen. What is their physicality? What is their financial attributes? This is a one-page performa, and literally, especially when we're doing this live and in person, we actually walk people through, and you filled it out with your cell phone calculator. Right? It's this simple. This is the basic math that underlies this one page of math. You could use this same structure to build a huge fancy building. It's the same bare ratios and thresholds that are necessary. And so once you learn the mechanics of a basic performa, it allows you then to apply it to many different situations. Okay, and we have advanced training and things like that that helps people build those next steps. What we want to reinforce to you is that this is 7th grade math. Okay, there's no calculus, right? There's no even algebra, basically. This is math. This is multiplication and division, right? My 6-year-old is crazily enough learning how to do like simple multiplication. It is not long from now that he'll be able to fill one of these things out. And so what I want to help you understand is that to demystify the idea that you can't do this. A normal human being who happens to have a business or another career or maybe looking for some side income, that you can't do this because you can. And the aspects of the work are not complicated by but they need to be put together, right? The performer is only one piece of the puzzle, but the individual pieces of the puzzles are not actually so overwhelming. What is a little challenging is assembling all the pieces together and making a whole lot of them. Right? At the end of our more advanced trainings, we help people build a package. This is a small snippet of the basic elements of a package. That perform I just showed you in a different format, a basic layout, a little 3D model, a picture of another building nearby that we're trying to aspire to be. This is what people are missing. You know, people say, Jim, well, I'd be a small developer, but I don't have any money. You know, how can I do a small development project without any money? And I say, well, if today, right, I introduced you to the person who had all the money you need to build this project, they'll sign a loan for you and everything. Could you then do your project? They say, well, no, because I don't have a project. It's like, yes, that's what you don't have. You don't have a package that explains how a building makes money. Now, I didn't say a lot of money. Every building has to make money. Incomes have to cover its expenses. That could, at the end of the day, be zero. But still, there are thresholds and ratios that everyone involved in the process, from zoning to planning to finance and banks, need to see, right? A small building investment package creates those very easy but complex parts to put that together. And so by learning those technical elements, right, you can actually then attract capital. There's actually far more capital sloshing around in most communities than people really know. What is the missing ingredient? What's the yeast in your place? The yeast is people who can put this package together, doing the kinds of projects that are relevant, important, and key to the future of your place. That's what's really missing. We can provide a little bit of that, some support and know-how to build some relationships. We can't supply the hustle though. So we're hoping that you and others that you know in your community and nearby might be the kind of people who want to do that work. And also you might be the kind of people who want to support others in doing that work, from your places of volunteer leadership, from places of your business or other local economic capacity, that you will actually be a part of helping support the various things that you need. Maybe you own a site, but you don't know what to do with it, but you need to partner with somebody else who can help you do a part of it, right? How would you do that? These are things that we can help provide in this session coming up. We'll have some more information we send out afterwards, but this is our website, incrementaldevelopment.org. Go to our events page. We have it February 23rd. It's a virtual seminar. It's about 4 hours long. And we teach some of these basic fundamentals. And moving forward, we have some other educational opportunities, very specific here to the town of Rockingham, where we're going to talk a little bit more about the buildings here we have pictured, right? We have a thing called STEP buildings, and STEP stands for small, time-tested, entrepreneurial, and purposeful buildings. And they're a catalog of the very most ubiquitous types of buildings that we see in our human scale neighborhoods. And by explaining those and explaining the thresholds that go with them, we will be able to help you all hopefully grow your vocabulary of the things that could be used to get the kind of development you do want to have in your town. We also have some opportunities here. We're going to be working with some of you specifically who have been more involved in your zoning and regulatory environments to look at and review how some of those could be improved by taking some of those test buildings and applying them to sites in your town. We're going to do it's called a spot test, and so we're going to have some results from that we'll eventually be able to share and talk to people about. And finally, we also will be able to talk to people about some of the ecosystem related issues of where some of your governmental agencies or some of your nonprofits and foundations and business corporations can do. We had a call a few weeks back with some folks who said, gosh, I have some great people moving to my town to, take unfilled positions. I'm having a hard time filling positions in my town. And when I do find someone to come work here, they have a hard time getting some housing. I would love to invest in some housing, right? I'd love to do that, right? And this happens in every town we go to, right? There are people with the wherewithal, with the resources, but they run a business. They got things going on. If they could just be partnered with somebody who had that investment package, who had a little hustle, who wanted to build some wealth for themselves, right? That local relationship has nothing to do with me, this guy from out of town, right? These are people in your place working together orchestrating your resources to be able to get to the outcome of the community's needs and for the health and welfare of your place. And so what we want to be able to share is that there is a way to get to yes. It may require a different allocation and relationship between the resources and the rules that you have currently. And the ability for us to learn from our ancestors, to be able to do the municipal math, to be able to focus on creating whole neighborhoods that are economically inclusive as well as socially able to meet the needs of our place. That's what we're working towards here. And we look forward to being able to share a little bit more as we move forward about things we're learning about your place. There is that's the third thing I was trying to mention. There is going to be a small market study that is going to look a little bit at housing, and a little bit at some commercial resources as well, to be able to look at what are some opportunities within the marketplace. And we're hoping to be able to help you calibrate some of those opportunities with particular building types and in particular sort of regulatory opportunities where maybe we can make a match between where in town, what is needed, and how that might be delivered. And so I think before the end of we call it our diagnostic service that we are doing with you all, that we'll be share a little bit more about how that could play out in your place as one example of how maybe you can move forward together. So with that, I see some more questions in the chat window for things that we can pick up along the way. But I will stop here because we are reaching the 7 o'clock hour. And I do also want to make sure some of you may need to step off at some point here in the next little bit. And I want to make sure that Sarah and Gary have a chance to more specifically lay out some of the other, particularly public-facing events that we have coming up and the dates that are associated with those, just to make sure we get those out there before many of you may have to step away.
Great, thanks, Jim. I think the only public-facing session we have that's actually scheduled right now is the Dirty Dozen, which is scheduled for February 4th. Jim, I don't know if you just want to say a few sentences on what will be covered then.
Yeah, the Dirty Dozen is our little internal name for the dozen most often things that we see that prevent the small scale development that folks most often want in their community. These are not things that are obvious to most folks, but they're kind of buried in the layers of regulatory code and in practices in our communities. And in many cases, they're sort of conflicting, right? One code says this, and another part of your code says this, and only on a site in your town do both of those pieces of code have to coexist and work together. And over time, those elements change and change independently. And so being able to take a look at where to go looking for those opportunities, or where to go looking for those things that might be not quite in line with each other anymore, and a little bit what to do about them. So that's what that talk will be about, to help share some jumping off point for some of the work that we'll be doing together.
Great. And Jen just posted a link to the event where you can register and sign up for that if you're interested. Jim, I don't know if you want to touch on maybe one or two of George's comments or questions, and then also I want to, obviously open up to anyone else who has any questions for you.
Oh, wow, George has been quite prolific. I didn't realize that these were all coming from, or many of them were coming from him. So thank you, George,
George has lots to say on this.
These are great questions. You're just right. This is good stuff here. Love to take a couple of these on, and please others do chip in or build off any of these questions that have been put forward to Forth. Stop here for a second and just really read to make sure I'm getting the gist of it correctly.
Jim, I'm just gonna stop sharing screen so we can all
sure,
see each other's lovely faces.
That's way better, indeed. I'm gonna move mine up so I can see you all more easily as well. Oops, hang on. Just did that, and then I lost the chat window. I'm gonna say just like right there. Okay. Had some early questions about filling vacancies and particularly how do old buildings have to line up with new codes? And that's an age challenge. There's a couple things There's a few regulatory tools. I know that Vermont has the International Existing Building Code. These are a set of rules that are specifically made towards understanding that existing buildings have existing conditions, and instead of needing to be able to somehow force a building to do something because of the current code that assumes you can just change anything you like because you're starting from scratch, we have changed our expectations about safety and health and how we do those things over time. And so there are lots of ways to make a building safe and accessible. And so that code tries to help get at the best practices, or as close as possible to codes as they would exist in new construction format, but doing so with a wider variety of methodologies for reaching the goal of safety. I mean, there's accessibility and there's safety. There's two separate things, and there's lots of ways to reach those goals. A couple of things that are important in perhaps to really specifically look at this question of ADA. It's important to know and to work in configurations of buildings that do and don't require those things. If we talk about old Main Street buildings, there is a thought process, and I'll dispel a little myth busting here, that is often seen on main streets because ADA fits into this. Many people say, well, if you're going to put residential on top of commercial, you have to have an elevator because you're doing that. And the answer to that is not necessarily. There are thresholds by which federal and state laws, but mostly federal rules, and this again is another set of things that we'll talk more about in some of the seminar class I talked about, where we're actually governed by a set of guidelines and rules that are actually not baked into our building codes, and accessibility is one of those sets of rules. And so the rule of thumb on one small subset of this is that you actually are allowed up to 3 units in an upper floor of a building, right, without requiring an elevator. Once you go to 4, you're in to meet the requirements, and typically those requirements are going to lead you to an elevator. But up to 3 units, that is a possibility. So in many cases for older buildings, especially if they have a 3rd story, where we say, oh, well, there used to be 6 apartments in this building, right? And our solution is, well, 6 is going to require an elevator. 6 is not enough to cover the cost of an elevator. So what about 3, right? How would we combine 2 of those units together? But maybe we make them, instead of 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom apartments, we make them each 2 bedroom, 2 bathroom apartments, right? They're still set up well to share, or even for a family. And so those kind of sleight of hand changes help to be able to avoid a $100,000 cost, right, of an elevator and the long-term maintenance that goes with it. And so those are important things to look at. Sprinkler systems are a lot harder to get around in older buildings. Those are usually the second impediment that we often see is, gosh, retrofitting a building for a sprinkler system is really expensive. There are ways, depending on how uses are mixed in a building, to avoid a sprinkler system by having beefed up fire protection in between. Some cases there's not. If you're putting a restaurant on the ground floor of an old building, you're not getting around not having a sprinkler system almost in all cases. A couple maybe small exceptions. So it's important to understand those needs. And for a town, a government that says, it's really important for us to be able to, we have a demand, it turns out, for those loft apartments, like just what we saw in downtown Grayling. We have a demand for those types of houses, those types of residences. And if we could only have a fund, or maybe there's a state program, to be able to say, what if we could have a $10,000 grant to help defer some of those costs of sprinkler systems? And here's why you might do that. What did you see when we were looking at the value per acre, right? Every time we were in a place where those were stacking of stories, right? Your downtown would be off the charts value per acre. It's such a tight place. There's small lots, very valuable. And someone asked, what does it mean by productive? I largely define productivity from just a purely financial sense as every building, every lot needs infrastructure, right? And if it's producing more value than what it's consuming in infrastructure, and infrastructure is a thing a town has to maintain, water lines and sewer lines, right? And the infrastructure those things lead to. There's utility companies and all the water, the gas and electric that goes with that. All those things are necessary to make land useful. And it's that ratio, right? everyone locally gets a chance to be able to determine what's the right ratio for commercial building versus a building downtown versus a house out on the edge. By the way, I also want to say farms are very productive. Why? Most places that are farms are usually a little bit off the beaten path. Where I grew up in Michigan, I grew up on a little set of houses, right? It was a little close to a subdivision. It was built in the 70s, but it was, a half mile away, the road that I lived off of turned to dirt, right? And then it turned into horse farms and dairy farms and agriculture, right? And those are very productive places because you know how much it costs to maintain a dirt road versus a 2 or 3 lane highway, right? Or even just a paved road, right? There's a serious cost. And even for the little subdivision that, I grew up in, my parents just got their subdivision. The last time that the street that my parents' driveway, goes to got resurfaced was about 35 years ago, right? I was a kid, okay? So, and that's on a very small little street, right? Not to mention the country roads that, are across our landscape, right? But farms and agricultural land and small farmsteads and little villages of hamlets, they're very productive. So it's about the intensity of your infrastructure, okay? So it is important to invest in buildings, that stood the test of time, because it is just as likely that that building that's been there 150 years could go another 150. Because what those buildings were built out of 150 years ago, I will tell you, even after they are decrepit or after they've been damaged or after they've been left for vacancy, right? In many cases, those buildings by our forebears, right? They resisted and overcame, even in their not great condition, a great deal, right? Largely, we build buildings today out of sawdust and glue. Right? The things that we build most often today would not survive under that level of neglect for that long a period of time. And for that reason, its ability to have staying power is something that we shouldn't overlook. Sometimes buildings do need to come down. Sometimes buildings have mold and have things that cause it to be difficult. But we need to carefully look at where those buildings are at. What is their flexibility and adaptability? And if we invest $10,000 or $15,000 in them with some or little return, and maybe it's a grant, right, for $12,000, $15,000. If that building goes back to productive use, what is the raise in tax value for that building going from empty because we can't find the right way to use it because we can't get a sprinkler system in it, right? Because it just doesn't pencil by itself. How much longer are we going to pay for the street and the sidewalk and the water line in front of that building, the center of Bellows Falls, for instance, and have that building not be as productive as it could be, right? With having a use and having it be financially viable to pay and to contribute its way. That's a very different conversation to a building a little bit out of town, which maybe has the same cost, right, but not the same productivity, ceiling, right? So it's important to look at your town, see what things are working well financially, which ones are not. We uncovered some very funky tax things in a recent conversation that may be skewing the lines, particularly with multifamily buildings. We're going to dig into that a little bit more as we go through our work here locally. But it's important to ask those questions. And I really appreciated those of you who were on that call that one day bringing those things up, because there is always warping in the system. And so it's important to look at how your town really is functioning. Where does the money come from? Where is it going? And is it doing the things that a normal human who does not have extra special knowledge of all the stuff we talked about tonight, does it make sense, right? Being able to look at your system and say, you know what, that just doesn't make any sense, right? Who knows here why this is what it is, right? And in fact, in most places, even places, my parents had lived in this town where I grew up for 50 years, right? They know a lot about a lot of things. My mother used to run the Chamber of Commerce, right? But even folks like that who maybe been in a place for 50 years don't know why the rules say what they say, right? The person who wrote that rule, they may be long gone, right? In heaven or the next town over. And so it's important to take a look at how we work together in our practices and with our rules and say, do they work for what we need to have? Have we tried to do the things with them that we want to see, right? In some cases, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, no one's doing it. So how could it possibly happen? Well, has anyone looked into seeing if it's plausible, right? Maybe if we could all change a little bit about what we were doing and how we play our part, we could see an outcome that wouldn't be possible unilaterally. And so I think those are important things to look at within your place, important things to look at, and how you measure where to make an investment, right? I would say that your core housing and the core streets of Bellows Falls are going to be places that are going to be a good investment. They stood the test of time. We see those places continue to stand the test of time in other places, but it's important to take a look at how much, how, and where. And I think that the place that you have in Rockingham, there's a lot of possibility, and the stressors that are happening in other places may lead to good results for your place as well. So I'm going to stop there for a second because I have to take a breath before going into this next fantastic question I'm glad George brought up about banking. But I'll stop there, and if anyone has anything else they want to add to that, or a follow-up question on that subject of rules and how do we deal with old buildings.
I think you covered everything.
Okay, good. Banking in a town, region, area like this, which I'll just say, is rural, and we do have some bigger and smaller communities. The consolidation within our financial sector in this country over the last, especially 15 to 20 years, has been, well, damaging. And the smaller the place, the fewer the options. And so part of the conversation with your financial institutions that you do have, and hopefully there are still one or two that are locally controlled or somewhat regionally controlled, right? You can go find a human somewhere in an office in a 50-mile radius that you can have a real conversation with, either as your town or as an individual, as a business owner and whatnot. But the truth of the matter is that most of our financial system today is set up, particularly like a 30-year mortgage, is set up for a secondary market. And what's important is to understand how those tools fit. And where you have projects that don't fit those tools, it's important to figure out how to feed them what they eat, we like to say. Okay? If you understand the thought process from a banker who is underwriting a loan and what they care about and the ratios that they have to not only justify to themselves, but justify to their regulatory arm. Right? There's 3 or 4 different regulatory arms the federal government has that oversees banks, depending on the size of the bank and if it's state or national. And so you have to understand their business. And it turns out most bankers are really eager to tell you about their constraints and the things that they can or can't do, or that they think they can or can't do. And having that conversation, both as individuals as well as the one great part about a local government is that they do have a bully pulpit. And collectively, the more local governments working together, saying we need housing and we need financing that does this for us. Like we have 25 buildings between the 4 towns in the 4 settlements and towns nearby that need this financing. What can we do, a local bank, credit union, et cetera, to meet this need? How big a loan do you normally service, right? So these are questions you can ask your banker, right? Hey, what is a good size loan for your place? Most, all banks have loan limits. They can only go so far. And as you get closer and closer to that limit, there's additional stipulations that they add on to, actually go up to that limit. Having a conversation with the folks locally about what those are and where there might be a good match. Don't ask them to do something above their limit, but do ask them to do something that is within their power and that is saying, how do we to yes, right? Hey, what kind of local guarantor would you need for that young person with a lot of hustle who's swinging a hammer, but has got a lot of student loans, right? Doesn't have, right? What person could we link that human up with who maybe has wealth, has property, maybe owns a business, but doesn't have the time and attention? Oh, well, Joe, who's the vice president of so-and-so industries, he's one of my best customers. And gosh, I know he's been telling me about how all his employees can't find any housing. You say you got somebody who wants to build a housing project, but they can't find a loan? Huh, right? It's a great part about being in a small town, and I grew up in one. You're only one church pew, one kid next door in class, right? From the right person in your place, because everyone knows each other. But what we don't understand is each other's business, and we don't understand the things that we can and cannot change. Once we lay those out on the table, we soon find that there is a solution. But if the young person with hustle doesn't know Joe, the local vice president at the local industry, and they cross paths every day, driving past each other, walking past each other on the street, right? That project may not happen, right? So banks, we'll talk more about this in our government, in some of the training classes and so forth, but it is a conversation, and don't underestimate, for those of you who are involved in government, to use that bully pulpit to say, look, local banks, regional banks, this is what we need, right? We have people who have looking at these kind of projects, but they're falling short. Maybe it's the government that can come in and say, look, we want to support local entrepreneurs on our main street to be able to own or occupy their buildings. And we're going to backstop a loan loss reserve fund, which may be just the good faith and credit of the town. It may not be that much money, actually, but it's the backstop that checks a box that makes a loan happen that may not have happened otherwise. And so that's where opening up a line of conversation, being creative, can begin to overcome what is most often seen. And this is one of those questions that's like, so many times people throw up their hands and say, gosh, I can't get a local banker in town to do this loan for somebody or with me. And usually the answer to that question is, have we looked at the risk profile that bank or banks are looking at, and can we provide the missing piece, right, that allows that project to move forward, right? And it may not be the likely suspect that can provide that missing piece. And collectively, we might know the right person who can supply that piece. So the follow-up question there about commercial rents. So two things. Commercial mortgages, depending on the value of a, say, a mixed-use building or a large multifamily building, which would be a commercial mortgage, there are two ways to think about that. New construction in most cases is very expensive. And so new construction in a place that has vacant buildings or vacant storefronts is going to be tough until those storefronts are filled. Well, how do you fill storefronts? Well, that's another conversation, right? But it's important to understand that if you try to jump those steps and say, well, we really want to build a new building here, but we haven't done the hard work of making sure that all the rest of our buildings that are just like that, but are located in a different location, aren't filled, it's going to be an uphill battle for years and years to come. Right? That's an ecosystem thing, right? Until that storefront can find a different use or a different way of being productive, to either put it back into productive use or to remove it from the pool of unproductivity, the comparables that will be used to value buildings that then are used to create how much money a bank can loan you to stay within the ratios they have to, makes a math problem. That math problem is relentless. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it's just a math problem. And so there is actually nothing illegal, to get to the third question there, about people living above their storefronts. And in fact, if you talk to the right flexible thinking banker, a 30-year mortgage might allow an owner occupant to buy that 2-story Main Street building and live above the shop and be below, because the right kind of 30-year mortgage, not every 30-year mortgage, there's lots of flavors of 30-year mortgages, but there are 30-year mortgages that will specifically, if the residential part is slightly more than the commercial part, either 25 or 50% more, then that is a possibility. Now, most of our commercial spaces in our old buildings, right, skinny buildings, long, deep, right, first floors, right? In many cases, those first floors are deeper and more square footage than most commercial uses need nowadays. Maybe we need to turn some of that commercial space into residential space that can be more productive, or can it be a small apartment, or heck, could be a lovely little Airbnb for people visiting your beautiful town in your falls, right? Wouldn't it be great if you had, instead of one big hotel that struggles to make it over time, the correct time of year, because it can fund itself for 3 months of the year, but the rest of the time it can't? Wouldn't it be great, rather than having one struggling hotel, that you had 30 locally owned little backs of shops and cottages in people's backyards to maintain that, to be able to take and capture that local productivity, right? Same 30 apartments, same 30 hotel rooms, I should say, right? but a different configuration, right? And a different thought process and a different way that that wealth is leveraged, okay, for those of you locally living. So one caveat, many places we find the zoning codes have outlawed residential uses on the ground floors for good reason, right? They don't want them in the storefront in the front. However, we can find ways to massage that, to tweak that. Say, we still need a storefront. That first 30 or 40 feet of the store, it's got to be an active use, right? Retail or something else, right? But that back 40 or 50 feet, right, probably doesn't need to be, right? And so how can we help those rules be shaped so that we can help those mixed use buildings that are struggling to find their proper use in the 21st century be able to make it work? So there are some pathways, there are some opportunities, there are some ways to, functionally turn back the clock, right, to that shop owner occupant. But we're going to have to overcome some regulatory issues, and we're going to have conversations with the right flexible thinking bankers who can actually see that this very same tool that they use all day to finance single family houses can also be used, if you actually look at the fine print of the underwriting criteria, for a building that looks a little different but still functions the same way. So those are some things that we can talk about further in future sessions. But the news to share is that it is possible, but it is widely misunderstood, and understood, right? If you walk into most banks today and say, hey, can I finance the 2 apartments above this small storefront, and I'm going to live in one of the apartments, can I please have a 30-year mortgage? They say, no, that's not, we do single family houses with 30-year mortgages, and that's what you do with them. And can you go see Bob down the hall here? He's in commercial lending. He can help you with your crazy hard Main Street building thing, right? That's going to happen, and until somebody says, no, actually, I have the term sheet of this Freddie Mac building, and I read the underwriting requirements. It says I can have 1 to 3 units, and as long as the commercial non-residential, in this case, space is no more than 25%, that you can do a 30-year mortgage with me and put 10% down as the owner occupant, right? I can tell you that most loan officers have not seen that term sheet that can do that and have read it to use it for anything other than a single family house. So that's collective education that we have to do with each other, our friends and colleagues. And every place I've gone, there's always one person who knows that, right? It's finding that one person and sharing that knowledge widely so that there's more than one bank in town that can do that transaction. Those are the things that we can work on collectively as governments, as community organizations, and as individuals stepping forward to prove that it can happen and be able to be the example for others to follow.
Great. I just want to be mindful of our time and also see if there's anyone else that wants to share or ask a question. I know Wendy, you just added something to the chat. I don't know if you want to share in person.
Sorry, I was
Sorry.
we were having dinner in the other room and it smelled really good. No, I did a lot of work with mixed use in Florida years ago, and it was the hot thing, but banks had no clue. It was really, really hard to get financing, especially when the residential was on top of the commercial, because the first workaround that we did was to have the residential adjacent to the commercial, and they could deal with that because it was mostly fire code stuff. But eventually, once it became profitable and they saw that there was a market for it, they found a way to finance it. And then just one other quick thing in Rockingham, and Gary, tell me if this is still the case. In downtown Bellows Falls, there was a prohibition of housing above the first floor. And I believe that is no longer the case. And one of the ways we found out that was even an issue was potential developers would call the zoning officer and ask if they could, when a building was for sale, they would call and say, hey, what can I do with the building? I'd like to do residential. And then they'd be told, nope, sorry, you can't. And then they're gone. So that's a way to find out. That's a pretty inexpensive way to find out what is marketable. too. And so once we found that out, then we changed the code to allow residential above the first floor. And just little tweaks like that can really help.
Awesome, thank you. Any last thoughts? And you know, Jim, we can share your email widely if people want to continue having sort of more in-depth or more detailed specific conversation.
I see a lot of familiar faces, those who've stuck it out to the end here. So I imagine I will see you all again sometime soon.
Yeah.
Or if not, you may have earned your golden ticket to join us for another scintillating edition, like learning about the Dirty Dozen, because I'm sure everybody can't wait. They've circled that on their calendars to find out how their regulatory environment has stymied good development in their town. So we do hope you tune in next time.
It's a certain kind of person that enjoys.
We try to make it interesting.
Yeah. And are we able to share the PowerPoint with people? Assuming
Absolutely.
that was okay.
I'll get along to y'all. Yep.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, well, I'm hungry. So unless there's any other last minute questions, I think this was great and super interesting, and we're all going to become small developers now.
All right,
Great
thank
evening,
you
y'all.
very much.
Stay
Yeah,
safe.
thanks everyone for coming.